All right. This is Introduction to Christian Denominations, July 10th. Okay, so here's what we're going to do today. There are a couple of things I want us to think about just to frame this entire exploration. I want to do some term definition that'll be important just as we have this conversation, that we have common language around it. I want to go back and do just a very brief overview of church history and pointing out where these significant shifts and why the significant shifts happen, kind of tapping into a little bit of last year's, for those of you with us for the Sunday series, as we looked at church history, but where the different denominations came in sort of that 2,000-year span. Because if you can have that framework, Orthodoxy is here, Roman Catholicism here, etc. And then we're going to go through, and I named 10 categories, or I sort of thought through 10 categories that we will identify each week in each of the different traditions or denominations. And there may be two more, but we'll see as it unfolds. We'll leave that space. But there are definitively 10 areas, and I want to talk about those just from each of them, the significance of why and some of the range. And then we'll end with if there's any final questions or anything that you might have that I've forgotten. And then next week we'll begin with Orthodoxy, and then we'll go Roman Catholicism, and then we'll do some splintering off of those and the various expressions of each of those denominations or each traditions. And then we'll get in, once we get past the 15th century, it starts to splinter and splinter and splinter. But as we looked at in church history last year, those splinters occur for very important and notable reasons. But above all else, my hope is that as you think about your journey through faith, that you'll look and say, oh, maybe I believe this, I'll believe this at this time in my life, and I believe this at this time in my life, and I believe this at my time in life. We all sort of go through a process of growth, not just from age, but sometimes from denomination, sometimes from personal relationships with people. We are encountering a different type of expression of faith, and we add. And so we're all this sort of, I wrote down, the first thing I want to say is that we're all ecclesial mutts. Chances are. I was raised Methodist for the first 7 years of my life. I don't remember anything from it, other than a few faint memories, but I was raised in the church. In fact, for the first 2 years, I wasn't anything, because my mom came to faith in a more active way when I was 2, and then we entered the Methodist church. So 5 years I was baptized and born in the Methodist church. Born and baptized not born, but baptized in the Methodist church, and I don't remember anything from it. I mean, it was the Methodist Church at the time, in the 1970s. But then I became Assemblies of God. My parents joined the Assemblies of God Church, and that I do remember. That did influence my thinking. That influenced all of the categories we're going to talk about were affected by that. And almost every single one of them was changed as I grew in faith. And that doesn't say that the Assemblies of God had it wrong. I don't believe that at all, and I'll get to that in a minute. But that when you look at where I was as a teenager, as an Assemblies of God person who went to Assemblies of God undergraduate and studied their theology on a undergraduate level, to moving to the Reformed tradition, to moving to Presbyterian, and then vacillating between Episcopalianism and Presbyterianism, and ended up a Presbyterian. And then the more I've been a Presbyterian, the more I value, and I know I've said that to all of you, I value very deeply my tradition for a lot of reasons. That's the other thing, I didn't think about that. Just read. Polity is the word that I forgot. It's important probably to mention each week about the various nature of one's polity of the church. But real quickly, just to sort of frame, we'll start. Nathan, you okay to start? You don't have to go into, just name, like I would say, Methodism, Assemblies of God, Reformed theology, I would say, because I'm in Presbyterianism. That's my journey. So where's your journey? You've been raised in...
When I was younger, I went to a non-denominational church, but I don't remember watching that. Don't necessarily feel like that influenced me. Right now, my dad's a pastor at a Wesleyan church, and that has definitely influenced me.
So from what you grew up with, it changed as you went to the Wesleyan church.
I don't feel like there's been much change,
Yeah.
honestly.
Because you don't remember what it was.
Right. Probably.
All right, okay, Alan.
Lutheran,
Mm-hmm.
which I was baptized at 18.
Okay.
And from that, it was kind of off and on till we got back up here, and then it became Episcopalian for a while, and then transferred over here, what, about 4 years ago? 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah.
They were coming over in the winter, and then we just stayed one time.
Yeah. No, I think you became a member under my leadership,
Yeah.
I really thought, yeah. Carrie, what was your background? Same? No, not.
Baptist,
Oh, Baptist.
and then this same thing
And
that
then Lutheran too, or no? Or Baptist to Episcopalian?
Baptist to Episcopalian. Yes.
Presbyterian.
I didn't see it.
Christie?
I was Lutheran with Southern Baptist mixed in, 'cause my great-grandfather was a Southern Baptist minister. Then Methodist.
It's like Missouri Synod Lutheran?
No, LC.
It's reconnecting. 1 sec.
Yeah, the touch screen.
No, it's just, this time of year, internet is horrendous, and we're over here in a satellite, so. Let it connect back in. Okay, Jim. Born and bred? All right.
I'm gonna call it Catholic press.
You're a closet Presbyterian? That's all right. There's a lot.
Reform.
You were born in the Reformed tradition? CRC or?
CRC.
CRC, that was just Christian Reformed Church, we'll talk about that.
Yes.
too.
Well, I'm probably the only one here that was born.
Born a
I'm
Presbyterian.
born a Presbyterian. I went to Methodist with both my grandmothers were Methodist.
Okay.
So
But you were born Presbyterian, then went Methodist?
no, I just went with my grandmothers.
Oh, okay.
Who were Methodist.
Yeah, we all have to make concessions.
Yes, yes. And just an aside, Paul was raised Assemblies of God.
Oh, yeah, I remember that now.
And I went with my mother-in-law one time when my daughter was a baby, and it like to have scared the bejeebers out of me. It was so scary.
Yeah. Yeah. No, trust me, I was there, yeah. And Marcia?
Well, I was born into the Presbyterian
Uh-huh.
church in Sprinkle Air, and was married in the Presbyterian church. And then got divorced a few years later and got into Assemblies of God for quite a few years. One time I went with my sister to this Assemblies of God church, and they were having a revival thing. Scared me to death. I was like, I gotta get out.
See, I'm not talking.
So it wasn't against you.
It wasn't just me, huh?
But then, that's where I came to know Christ, and I was baptized in the Assemblies of God. Then when I moved up to Lake City, I basically had been for about 15 years in Grace Fellowship, and now I'm back home
Home,
in the Presbyterian church.
very good. And we love that. Marcia, two Marcias, maybe spelled differently though.
I was raised a Methodist until I married, but I must say I was raised in Shawnee, Oklahoma, which had OBU, and it dominated the city. We had no
OBU.
prom, we had no, it was very.
What's
Baptist.
OBU?
Oklahoma Baptist
Oh,
University.
okay.
So I would say most of my friends, 10 of my best friends were Baptist, my best friend Presbyterian, and then I married and we went to Presbyterian, baptized our son Presbyterian.
Yeah.
Then we left there and went to kind of a weird church. I don't know that it had a denomination, but then from there we went back to the Methodist church where my daughter was baptized. And then we are now in a loose Disciples of Christ. I have been there 10 years and I've heard Disciples of Christ 10 times. It has it on our marquee, and that's about it.
Yeah, a lot of Presbyterian
We don't
churches
talk
are like
about
that too, yeah.
Oh, they are? Okay.
Yeah,
That you don't mention
They'll say, I mean, it'll say a you know, in other words, you wouldn't know it unless you looked in their bylaw, or in their, like, who we are, and would say we are associated with, but they just kind of, I mean, you know, I mean, we could I don't think that would happen under my watch, but we could very easily do the same thing here, because we're such an ecumenical body. But to me, I'd rather anchor us somewhere and allow those differences to exist, and to have a tradition to guide us, than to just sort of flatten that. I don't think denominationalism is bad, as long as we approach it with humility. So, well, you see, lots of things represented, and we are, like, this is by far the most diverse denominationally and theologically, if anything, I've ever worked in before. I mean, you know, we have, you know, the fact that we have multiple Roman Catholics, and actually one coming over to join the Presbyterian Church. How you feel about that? We're stealing one. So. Don't worry, Jim, you'll get jokes for the next 2 weeks, and then it'll be done. No, not really. Not at all. No, I know, I'm just kidding. I love Jim. No, and you know, I had someone describe denominationalism to me as Baskin Robbins. There are lots of flavors, 31 flavors, and there's more than 31 denominations, but there are essential elements to ice cream. I'm not talking about sorbets, that's the cult of ice cream. But cream, sugar, you know, those are, and there are some essentials that will bind us together. And ultimately, that's the goal of what I hope hope happens here, is that amidst not only your self-understanding of, like, oh, this is maybe why I believe, and I think a lot of people who find themselves, they say I'm a Presbyterian, but they actually have more Methodist theologies running through their head. And that's just because we, as a Presbyterian church, have lost some of our Reformed distinctives, and not necessarily in a bad way, but sometimes, I mean, but some of the character, you know, like free will, like, you know, you talk to most Presbyterians, they'll be like, yeah, free will, and you're like, nope, that's not actually what Presbyterians hold doctrinally. And we do hold free will, but it's a nuanced understanding of that it's not total free will. So I love the fact that we'll share this denominational journey, but so there are 3 things I want to happen. 1, I hope you have a fuller understanding of your own theological perspective, where you came from, why you believe what you do, maybe some of the beliefs that you have now that aren't even in, you know, you might be a Presbyterian now, but the things you believe aren't in accordance with what the Presbyterian Church believes. Well, there's probably a reason for that. And it's probably from how you were raised. It's probably from the cultural environment you were raised in. I mean, whether or not you're Baptist or not, if you're raised in the South, chances are you're Baptist. And if you're Presbyterian there, you're kind of you know, that influence dovetails with one another, and it overlaps. Now, interestingly enough, depending on geographically, that can mean different things. We like to say in the world of Presbyterianism that if the farther east you go, the more high church you get. You go to New York church, you know, New York downtown, a Presbyterian church, and they may be carrying the Bible, and like an Anglican church. You go out to the West Coast, and it's very much an evangelical. Like, you go to Menlo Park Presbyterian, and you would think you were in a non-denominational church. The reverse, and you'll get also within the liberal conservative spectrum within our denomination, people in the East are far more liberal. I'm doing it reverse for me. In the East are far more liberal, in the West are far more conservative. But interestingly enough, Methodism is flip-flopped. The farther west you go in Methodism, the more liberal it gets. The farther east you go, the more conservative it gets. So those are some of the distinctions we'll talk about within the denominations, because within every denomination you have sub-variations. We have 5 or 6 Presbyterian churches, yeah.
Isn't it also rural versus urban?
100%. Within some, yes. Yeah, but I think in general, you'll still get that movement depending on where you're at through the country. Things get muddy in the middle. But yes, a lot of states, both politically, and I would say that would be more of a last few decade in terms of the liberal conservative perspective versus theological differentiation perspective or expressions of worship. You know, you go out west in Presbyterians and you'll have a lot more praise music within Presbyterian churches. You go out the east, you got, like, you know, a wall of pipe organs a wall of pipes for the pipe organ. So it depends where you're at. 2, I hope you have, that we develop an understanding of others' perspectives, because it is, I think probably, I would say, I don't know, 60% of the next 11 weeks, I could probably do mostly off the top of my head because I understand the differences between denominations. And what that does, it allows me to engage with each one of you within, and the entire congregation within their own perspectives. If someone says, I'm Wesleyan, I immediately have a little Wesleyan module that plugs in, and I understand that perhaps some of the perspectives you're coming from. And if you say I'm a Seattle Presbyterian or a Seattle Methodist, like there are things. So as we understand how the world and how the nation and in particular views and how the different denominations function with one another, I think it gives us a greater understanding and generosity in terms of perspective. But three, what I hope it does is it gives all of us a fuller view of who God is. I've often said that my experience is not the human experience. My experience in the world is my experience in the world. Every perspective that's added into that, the collective experience that we all have here, and if we all shared about how we viewed life, what we're going through, our hardships, our joys, things that make us happy, things that make us sad, we would start to see a fuller picture of human experience. The more people you have, the more fuller that is. It's called deductive reasoning. You take all these different cases, and that's not to say that it's everyone's experience, because there's always going to be variation, and there's going to be a bell curve, and we're going to see that within denominations too. There's always a bell curve. There's the dominant, and there's the ends. But what that does is it allows us to see that God is experienced through a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different periods in church, a lot of different regions in our nation and in the Western world. I mean, you want to talk about, you have the hemispheric difference between the Western world and the rest of the world, but or even the Southern and Northern. I mean, how they view things. I mean, I was talking to someone the other day. We view Easter as a time of spring and new life and green. Well, if you're in Australia, it's getting dark and gloomy, and they're going into their winter, so they don't have those same notions. No, you can't. It's up there. It's way up there. I'll just move her. There. How about that? No, what was I saying? What was the last thing I said? Oh, yeah. Thank you. But then as we see Eastern Orthodox, the Eastern Church versus the Western Church. And I would say even the Northern Hemisphere, where I think a lot of that East and West has influenced us, you go to the Southern Hemisphere and you have Pentecostalism running rampant. You have the spirit world and a totally different view of the world, totally different cosmology of how the world functions to the way we in the West, in particular in the educated West. We sort of compartmentalize and allow the scientific method to guide our understanding, whereas in the Southern Hemisphere of the world, most of it, other than in the West, in Australia and New Zealand, you get a very more spirit-led or spirit-driven understanding of the world. So we'll get a better view of the world, a better view of God and how God functions in it. And I think the guiding verse for this whole series is going to come from 1 Corinthians 1:21. It's one of my favorite passages in Scripture, actually. And it's talking about the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of humans. And it says, "For since the wisdom of God," meaning the very thing that is the essence of all things that are created and in existence, and in the fullness of who God is, "the world through its wisdom did not know him." We couldn't apprehend, we couldn't understand, we couldn't receive, we couldn't experience God in the fullness of the way we were meant to. We couldn't understand. For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him. And here's the beautiful, this is the gospel. This is the love and grace of God. God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. So God was pleased with the foolishness that was preached. So in other words, although the wisdom of God has been somewhat revealed in Christ and in Scripture, and we have inklings of that, and we have some understanding of that, the vastness of that, and if we truly understood that upside-down kingdom, we would say, you know what, there is no fear in this world, because again, this world is not our own. But even though we know that and we understand that, we live in the fear of the world, and we exist in that fear of the world, and we work and we save and we try to prepare for our lives in the fear of that world. And there is some otherworldly sense of abandonment of this world that comes through in Scripture. And I think what we have in this is in all of the expressions, and you got to think about it from the very first time God revealed himself to Adam, and then to Noah, and then to Abraham, and then all through Israel's history, and then different in the Maccabean intertestamental period, and then you get in the New Testament church. In every century since the church was established in the first century, there has been variations and differentiations in how people worshiped and how they understood doctrines. And so I have come to a place where I think it is asinine and nothing but humanistic hubris to suggest that any of us have a corner on the market. And in fact, the very reason I am a Presbyterian is because Calvin, at the core, he says we can't approach anything in theology without understanding ourselves as depraved beings, unable to fully understand other than what was revealed to us. And in doing so, we ought not, now although he does suggest a lot of things for the Christian church, we ought always hold our theology outside of the essentials of who Christ was loosely. This is often why I say, where I am orthodox in my belief, meaning I align myself with a group of people, I'm agnostic. I did reverse that a little. Where I'm agnostic in my beliefs, like, do I know exactly what the Eucharist does? Is it the actual body and blood of Christ? Is it some sort of spiritual presence? Is it some sort of participation experience? Is it just a symbolic thing? I don't know what I hold something to be true, but I don't really know ultimately what God or Jesus intended on that night. But, so where I am agnostic in my belief, I can't say for certain what that happens in that moment where you take the bread and the wine. I'm orthodox in my confession, and I've aligned myself with someone. And I think the biggest challenge that I have in the non-denominational churches today, and that's not to slam on any of them, is because I think there's a lack of accountability and there's a lack of communal theology. It's one of the things that, although I don't agree with everything about the Roman Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, I value the fact that there is an acknowledgement that it's a multiple century long pursuit and understanding and refinement and expression of worship of who God is. It doesn't come lightly. It's not on a whim. So all that is to say is, as we approach this, we approach it with humility. We approach it with a sense of none of us have it right. None of us have it right. And what we find in history, and what I hope I communicated last year as we looked at it then in the Sunday sermons, was that the challenge that we had all along through history is everyone thought they got it right. And they tried to control the power of the church because they thought they had it right. And far be it from us to make that same mistake again. If we have 2,000 years, probably plus another 4,000 for the history of the Old Testament, where power was the name of the game as well, you start to see a pattern and say, actually, it's the disempowering of our human selves that allows that spirit to be empowered and spirit to move. Because if we're trying to control it, then, yeah, Marcia.
How can you say you're agnostic because you don't believe the way that somebody, you don't understand the way that somebody else believes? That's not being agnostic.
Well, it's uncertainty. It's not, atheism is a denial, agnosticism is an uncertainty. But I'm orthodox in my confession, so it's like the resurrection of the body. None of us know what's going to happen to that body at the end. If we do, if we really thought that, maybe we shouldn't be cremating ourselves, unless we're trying to test the bodily resurrection, which I think is funny, which is why I wanted to be spread throughout the four corners of the world. So when my body was resurrected, they'd have to get me from the depths of the ocean. But Shannon won't allow that to happen, so I got to be buried intact. But I'm going to have a chessboard on top of me, so it's okay.
Well, I have a question.
Yes.
If I might.
Yeah, of course.
You said, hold your theology outside of the essentials of the church.
Loosely.
What?
Hold them loosely outside of the essentials.
Hold your theology loosely. But what I'm asking you is, what are the essentials?
Who Christ is. So last year when we looked at the the world religions, and we constantly compared it back to Christianity. And I kept saying again and again, I don't know if you remember it, but I remember saying again and again, this is what makes us different. We believe in the uniqueness of who Christ was, that Christ is the incarnate God, that Christ's life, birth, life, death, and resurrection and ascension, all a part of Christ's work, brought salvation and reconciliation to humans with God, and that we will experience some sense of eternity with that God.
So believing what you just said isn't essential.
That is the most essential nature. That's what defines us as Christians. It's what makes a Unitarian not a Christian.
Okay, okay.
Not that they not that they don't have Christian theology and a lot of stuff, but if Unitarians say there is no Christ, the God is that Jesus wasn't Christ and we weren't saved through Christ, well, then we differ.
Okay. Okay.
So, because that's where, the same thing with Mormons, that's where it deviates from that, because Mormons don't hold the same uniqueness of Christ. And, and honestly, you can be a Christian pluralist and still hold that there's a uniqueness of Christ, but that God may reconcile outside of that. But that would be an agnostic confession, and I don't make agnostic confessions. I make Orthodox confessions. So where I am uncertain, and you know what? I don't know what happens in the Eucharist. I'll teach what happens in the Eucharist in the tradition that I'm in. But there, as we'll see, there is an array of views for every single one of all of the top 10 theological issues that we're going to go through. There's a vast array. I mean, how you view how many sacraments there are. Is the Roman Catholic Church wrong because they have 7 sacraments, or do they just view their understanding of sacraments differently than the Protestant Church? But does that mean one is wrong or one is right? I don't know. I mean, and I'm not about to, and so where I don't know for certain and where I can't express for certain, those things don't matter, because they really don't matter.
They don't matter, so it doesn't make you agnostic.
It doesn't matter, maybe it's we might be defining or using the word agnosticism differently.
Yes.
I think that, I think for those who've heard me teach for years, I've been saying that I probably have said that at least a dozen or so more times. But I think it's important because what it allows us to do is allows us to say, I have some things I'm kind of uncertain about, but I'm aligning myself with the tradition. That's not to say that that tradition is perfect. We see that in this 1 Corinthians passage. And it's not to say that they have the answers, but it's to say that for my accountability, for the relinquishing of the individuality of my own discernment, I align myself with the tradition. Does that mean it's perfect? No. I confess soul sleep. Does that mean that's the way it happens? Probably not. I don't know. Does it matter in the end? Not really. So the essentials are what matter. And this is why the Presbyterian Church is the big umbrella, because we hold on to the essentials and we allow the other things to be held loosely, because they're non-salvific. So issues of salvation are things we take very seriously. Non-salvific issues, we say, different time, different places, we acknowledgement. That's why we are Reformed, coming from the Reformed tradition, and always reforming, because we understand that to say that we have it, as we'll talk about, the Pentecostals and the holiness movement that came out of the turn of the last century, they thought that they were the new invention of the church. The previous 1900 years of the church messed it up. And there's lots of strains that have come out over the last century and a half that believe that. And there's merit to some of it, but that doesn't mean that they're right. And so, again, that's why I'm a Presbyterian, is we don't hold it very tightly. So we do things decently in order, but very loosely. Okay, a few terms just to go over. Interfaith. So there are 3 ways to talk about faith expressions. And I say expressions because I don't think denominationalism is a term. Denominations are like denominations of a dollar or currency, as with 1, 5, 10, 20, etc. Different types. There's no value in denominationalism in terms of the way we talk about it, but there are 3 terms that we use because we're kind of combining 2 of them in this. One, interfaith, or world faith. That's what we talked about last year. Interfaith means that there are world religions, and we looked at 13, but there's lots of them, but they're the main 5, and then there's a second tier. But that is, when we talked about other faiths in the world, that's an interfaith conversation. That's what we did last year. We talked about the interfaith nature of that. We talked about different expressions. And in some sense, Christianity has an interfaith aspect to it because we draw much of our theology and understanding of the scripture from Judaism. We're influenced by an entirely different worldview that doesn't accept us. And likewise, Islam is that continuation of that trajectory. They believe they are the third dispensation of God's revelation to humanity. It first came through Israel, then it came to the Christians, and then it came to Islam. So they're doing the same thing we've done. They've just carried the project on a little further. And as we saw last year, you know, there was a Baha'i or one of those that was like there were 8 or 9 different ones. And so that concept of God's revelation through different dispensations, and honestly, dispensationalism, bless you, is what defines the holiness Pentecostal movement of Azusa Street in the early 1900s. This new, you know, the Spirit is, all these revivals were happening, and it was like a second Pentecost. And if they felt like, oh, the whole church for 1900 years, no, and the dispensationalists, as we'll talk about them shortly a little bit, are Pentecostals, Assemblies of God's, holiness movements, Baptists, evangelicals, non-denoms. So when those folks who find themselves in those camps often don't view the main lines or Orthodox or Roman Catholics as Christians. I mean, you know, that was one of the things that that we were constantly facing. I mean, honestly, that judgment has existed upon this church throughout the history of the communities in this town. So at times and various points, and that's just the nature of what it is. Ecumenism, so that's interfaith. We won't talk a lot about interfaith, but it's important to have that that's the largest category. Ecumenism is talking about different Christian traditions. And what I mean by that are there are 3 official Christian traditions. There's Orthodoxy, there's Roman Catholicism, and there's Protestantism. And everything all the way to non-denominationalism falls into Protestant theology. As much as there is a break somewhat in the non-denominational in that Pentecostal holiness movement that happened last century, it still falls into the umbrella of Protestantism because their theology is derivative of that. Denominationalism technically is the variations of the Protestant church. So it doesn't really, you wouldn't talk about denominationalism as related to Roman Catholicism or to Orthodoxy. You would say that there are different parts of each of those, but they don't, but there's still and yes, and some might be rejected in the Catholic Church, like the liberal Catholics are like, no, we're not accepting, you know, the main line says we're not accepting them or something. But in the end, Catholicism is Catholicism. Protestantism is not. We are the Baskin Robbins of the of the ecclesial world. So interfaith is the biggest category. Ecumenism is the different traditions of Christianity, Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestant, and then you have denominationalism on the lowest level, which is all the different variations. And they developed and expanded historically, so it's a splintering effect. At times I'm going to mention the visible and invisible church. And this is the transcendent aspect, and this is probably a more concept from our last century of theological expression. There's this whole category called missiology, and it's not about missionary work, it's about the mission of the church and the vocation the church has. So when I led the Presbyterian Church, I was the national director of the collegiate ministry for 4 years. And I would go to these collegiate churches and I would say, when you open your door and look out your front door, what do you see? And many of them would say, we see college students, you know, because they're a college church. They're on a college, practically bordering or sometimes on the college campus. It is a missiological emphasis or a perspective that says that church's job is to reach out to college students because that's there. So if you're downtown, you know, there's a church in Hollywood that actually has this incredibly, I mean, it's a fantastic homeless ministry. Why? Because when you look out the doors, they see homeless people. Why do we minister to hikers? Because they're here. we are a missiological expression of the church because we have taken the context and the culture into consideration about how we understand our vocation. And so we offer reconciliation and grace and mercy and love and hope through what we're doing here. That's missiology. And that signifies, and that term, then going back to visible versus invisible church, the visible church is everyone who claims Christianity in the whole church, who claims they're a Christian, everyone who understands it as a cultural way is the visible church. But that doesn't mean that everyone is within, real living out their faith. It doesn't mean that they necessarily have salvation. We see that in the parable of the sower. We see that in the Presbyterian tradition through John Calvin's writings, that faith falls and blossoms, and not everyone who was circumcised remained in Israel, and not everyone who's baptized will remain a Christian. But we baptize nonetheless. So the invisible church is the underground church. It's the real church. It's the church of those who, it's still, not that it's not visible, but you wouldn't be able to say, yeah, you are, you're not, you are, you can't do that. So it's beyond our sense that God's the final judge of who the invisible church is. Another term that I want to just make sure we're clear in particular is we use the term Catholic. Catholic, and someone asked me about this, we say the Apostles' Creed, and it says, I believe in the Holy Catholic Church. Well, we're not talking about the Roman Church. That creed existed before the Roman Catholic Church grabbed a hold of that nomenclature. Catholic at the time of the Apostles' Creed meant universal, or the invisible church, or the church at large, the church as a whole. The Roman Catholic claimed that church, or claimed that title, or claimed that name. I'll have to research when it was exactly, but I believe it was around the time of the 2 centuries after this Great Schism, where you start to see that identity. There's a claim, in the Catholicism is a claim that we're the church over and against the Orthodox Church. And we looked at that last summer in the sense of there was that split because they were claiming to have who was in charge. And the Pope wanted more authority than the 7 bishops or archbishops in the Eastern Church, and the Pope wanted to be the leader of leaders. Non-denominational apostolic, and we'll talk about that more towards the end of this series, because that when we deal with what's in the last century, the Pentecostal Church, the holiness movements, they believe. As we look at a quick evolution of history, in the first 300 years of the church before Constantine became a Christian and instituted the church as an institution or an entity of society and culture, there existed a more raw version of the church and more localized version of the church. There was no common understanding of baptism, of sacraments, of liturgy, other than was passed on culturally. And there's a belief, I think, to some extent, that those in the last century will say, home churches are often an expression of that. We're going back to the original, the early, even before that, to that sense of before Constantine made the church a thing, we're a more organic expression of the church. And the last thing that we won't talk about a lot, but just that Mormon, the term cult has 2 understandings. One is a doctrinal deviation. The Mormon Church, for example, is a cult for us because they take our Bible, they take the whole Holy Scripture, that was we look at it as one of their sacred books, but they also have the Book of Mormon, and they add that to it. So there's a deviation. They no longer are within our bounds of orthodoxy. They've deviated too much. And where there is, there's another cultural factors of adherence, of extreme, devotion, of high expectations, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, any questions about that? We're doing good, yeah.
When,
I'm gonna get some more water while you ask.
in Southern California, a long time ago, back in the 60s, and we lived in Anaheim, and there was a church there called the Crystal Cathedral.
Yeah.
I've forgotten his name. What was his?
Shaker? No?
Is that Spurgeon?
No.
No. Charles Stanley? No. Swindell? Jim Baker? I'm just kidding. I know.
Please no.
I'm just joking. But what about it anyways?
Well, anyway, we started going there, they met originally in a, outdoor movie lot.
Oh, this is Jesus, is this the Jesus Freak? Chuck, no, that's not it.
No,
It's a giant church that looks.
No, I've been there, Crystal Cathedral, yeah.
the Crystal Cathedral.
Yeah.
Then whoever this man was that founded it, they grew from that. Because we went there when my daughter was just a baby.
Mm-hmm.
And then they built the Crystal Cathedral, which was a sight to see.
Yes.
And I mean, now, no telling what the cost would be in something like that.
Well, yeah.
But how would you define a church like that?
Like what?
Like, would it be Pentecostal? Would it be?
I don't know offhand,
Non-denominational?
I just typed it in and it's not pulling up. I don't know. I don't know off the top of my head. It's a modern day, I mean, there's some church history roots, because I think there's a lot of cult of personality in the church. I mean, I think it functions that way in a lot of ways. I mean, in spending much of my life trying to ask why is the church in decline, I remember one of my doctoral colleagues saying to me, I don't think, he said he wanted to do research on the cult of personality. And he said, the biggest indicator of a success of the church is the charisma of the pastor. And that is unfortunate in our society. But it is the way I think societal influences work when you have a society that is drawn to, I mean, you know, I think people go where energy is, people go where power is, people go where money is, people go where programs are. Why are we growing as a church? Well, because we reached that tipping point where there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of enthusiasm, and people want to be with something that feels like you're doing something that's significant and real and a lot, you know, I mean, you know, and so now I say it doesn't always happen to that way. I don't think that, for example, the Taizé community grew to 100,000 pilgrims strong every year around the personality of Brother Roger. So I do think there are movements, and I do think there are places, but even you could say that even Jesus, you know, Jesus was a popular figure. He was charismatic. He was telling stories. He was entertaining. I mean, there was healing. There's lots of things about him that drew people to him. And that's just the nature of it. So.
There's a term I heard, mule churches,
Mule, as in M-U-L-E?
because they don't reproduce.
They don't what?
They do not reproduce. They're old, I should say old mules.
Yeah.
I'm just saying they're not growing.
They're not growing, yeah.
And they're, you know.
Sustaining their
they're
existence.
old. I mean, they're not old.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say old, but mule churches don't reproduce, they don't grow.
Yeah, Assemblies of God is, you know, I was surprised to hear how many Assemblies of God folks we have here, but Assemblies of God is one of those denominations that, because it was established at the beginning of the 19th century, or the 20th century, the early 1900s, that most denominations that have a longevity, they have to push past the 100-year mark. So they're in a place where they're struggling. And it's honestly, it baffles me how many times I hear that people have Assemblies of God influences, but as a denomination, it's dwindling the same. It's lost, it's
What
you know.
makes a person, like my in-laws, they were Baptist, and then all of a sudden they go to the Assemblies of God. And I've always just wondered what draws a person to that environment.
Oh, I mean, I was raised in it. I think that there is a sense of spirit-led power. I think there's a lot of emotionalism. I think I mean, you leave feeling pretty hyped up when you leave an Assemblies of God worship service. It's you know, I would say it's the, you know, crazy uncle arm of the evangelical church.
They have been using that spirit by other girls.
Oh.
And honestly, the Assemblies of God was not an insignificant denomination. In the world of youth ministry, the Assemblies of God was the leading denomination. There are Presbyterians and mainline denominations were way behind in their youth ministry methods. Now that's taken over to some extent, and as it's become a discipline and has theology undergirding it, then it's sort of leaned heavily on the denominations that have richer or more, deeper theology around some of that. But I think that though people switch most of the time not because of theology, I think they switch either because of they have relationships there, or they they prefer an expression. Because I think the Spirit moves in all of them. I'm never one to deny that the Spirit moved in the Assemblies of God as I grew in that faith. Like, I wouldn't be where I was today. I felt called in that tradition, in that denomination. So I don't deny that the Spirit moves there. I don't deny that the Spirit moves in the Presbyterian Church. I don't deny that the Spirit moves in the Roman Catholic Church. You know, I've many times in my life thought about going Orthodox. Just because, like, you know what, let's go back to as close as we can to I'm very happy with where I am. And I'm saying in times, I don't think I would, not that I am so betrothed to the Presbyterian Church that I wouldn't leave. I mean, like, but for me, and I'm a little different because I've went through many years of theological education and had to, and I chose a denomination based on doctrinal stance, not on expression. I mean, somewhat expression, but I like going into Pentecostal churches. I enjoy going into black churches. I like even, I wouldn't say I'm a huge contemporary worship fan, more in the modern era. Back in Hillsong days, I liked it more. But that's not even really because I don't enjoy the music, but because I'm in an environment where I focus more on hymns and historical, I always say if a contemporary worship song lasts 100 years, I'd be glad to integrate it into my worship style. But I'm not, and I'm happy to listen to contemporary worship as to feed my soul, just as listening to music. But I don't want to lead with that necessarily because it's ephemeral. I don't know, and it's often more focused on the individual, which is representative of the culture we live in.
You said Hillsong, so that's basically from Bethel Church?
Yeah, back in the 90s and early 2000s.
Medical things?
It is, but I mean, I was formed in that. So like, to me, when I hear some of the, even though I, somewhat internally scoff at Shine Jesus Shine, there are many times where I sang that with the fullness of my spirit and praised God with that. So for me to deny that it's not useful and not fruitful would be to deny my own experience of God. So, that's again why I don't hold anything too tightly, because I love it all. I love some of it more than others, but I love all. Yes.
I just wonder though how God looks at the splintering of the church, and has that increased in the last century, so that there are more and more denominations, or is that not the case? And the other thing, it seems as though the more denominations, the more there's a sense of we got it right and they're all wrong and they're all heretics.
Yeah, and that's an effect of two things. One, the last century of this newfound sort of view of the Spirit and everything that comes, again, all those dispensationalists. We'll talk about the difference between, there's covenant theology, which is what I talk about all the time. I'm not a dispensationalist. That means that God has a plan through the whole thing, but God is with us and interacting. Dispensation says that God reveals at certain times, and those who hold that God is now in the last century revealed the most accurate, the most fullest expression, then judge those 1900 years of history as inferior.
But I think churches are more accepting now of other churches. Yeah. I know the Roman Catholic. The
Roman Catholic Church absolutely is, and it's about time.
Yes, and I agree.
No kidding. No, I think largely the evangelical world. I mean, I've had people suggest that I wasn't really a Christian here in this town because I was Presbyterian. Yeah.
Oh, my former in-laws, Jim, you're not bad for being a Catholic. Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Shannon's Roman Catholic,
yeah.
and honestly, in the Protestant world, the amount of slams that the Catholic Church gets, and I always say, you know what, we wouldn't be where we were if we stand on the shoulders of Roman Catholics.
My Catholic friend told me, she said, well, you Protestants, you have a disruption and you just create another denomination. And the Roman Catholics have just stayed. Do you know what I mean?
They try to work it out, yeah.
Protestants are denominations, Catholicisms are not.
I say yes and no because there's a lot of factions in the Catholic Church.
Okay.
There's a lot of very right-wing conservative churches and very liberal ones.
But the vast majority finds itself in the same.
And there's even churches that split and become women priests. So it's a wide variety.
But does your doctrine?
No, our doctrine doesn't. No.
And that would be the same mostly
What
for,
what I think happens is those others influence it.
Yeah.
And I think right now, the big influence is the Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah.
And we're getting a big.
well, you're a global
And it's
church.
becoming much more conservative.
Yeah.
Than it used to be.
Well, and this is why the United Methodist split, and rightfully so. I 100% agree with what happened with the Methodist Church, and it needed to happen because the more progressive liberal faction of and I would say moderate left to progressive liberal faction of the United Methodist Church believes, and it was largely centered around LGBTQIA plus issues. But the global church, if you're in Africa, you can't expect someone in Africa to come along with modern day Western expressions and values. That's just another form of colonialism and imperialism. We have the right way to do it. You have to follow us. So they needed to split. The difference is, and going back to that, is the Roman Catholic Church is a global church. It's not split. They will not split, and they have to take into consideration the global perspective. Again, and I think in a very healthy way, because we see the fullness of who God is through the fullness of the church. So as much as I don't agree with a lot of splintering, I think that it also, if you look at it from a historical perspective, at least for the last 2,000 years, you see a much more fuller view of who God is and how God has worked through and in humanity.
And I think there's a lot of roots in all churches, the churches to be more accepting, maybe.
Yes, some churches.
Some churches.
But no, I wouldn't assert that nationally. I actually feel like even, because everyone's prejudiced against someone. Catholics don't, the Orthodox don't accept the Catholics don't accept the Protestants. The mainliners think the evangelicals have gone wacky, and the evangelicals think the rest of the church aren't Christian. So, everyone's pointing to someone saying, you're not in the club. And honestly, for many years, and I don't know if I'll ever do it, and some ideas I think I will, but after I read the Animal Farm, George Orwell's Animal Farm, I was just, bless you. One, I was studying communism and at the time during my PhD in social structures, and we listened to it on the way to going to Ohio to visit my mom, and we just listened to it on tape, and I was like, oh my gosh, this thing is so filled with symbolism, and it was just blown away. And I've wanted for years to write something the book, an allegory called The City of Dog. And I wanted to characterize each denomination as a breed of dogs. So anyway.
Can you tell us anything about the split from the meeting you just went to?
Not here, but after we're done with this, if you want to hang out for about 5 minutes, I can fill you in. So, just because we'll get to that, and that actually is going to be a topic, and we as a church will have to deal with that because everything worked out okay, but there's still some definitional work. And just so you all know, I'm going to be at the forefront of some of this definitional work. One of the main voices against that overture that came forward, and I are planning on doing some writing because we want churches to be more informed about a larger view of this. Because right now we have these two end views that are arguing, and I want to give a moderate perspective. So let me give you just to frame again, and it literally let me like a 3 to 5 minute version of the history of the church. And I want you, and you've heard this before, but not everyone has, and so I just want to make sure that we're going to look at the church through epochs of 500 years. And I talked about this before. Phyllis Tickle wrote a book called The Great Emergence, and her argument was that every 500 years the church shifts. So Christ is on the scene, Christ dies, Christ resurrects, you have the early church. All of the biblical books that are written were written within 80 years after the beginning, after Christ's death. Maybe 90 into the early, depending on when you want to date them. But pretty much most of the corpus of our literature of what happened in the early church. So that early church period really extends probably safely to about 150. But for the first 350 years of the church, or 320, or 313, whatever, 18 years of the church, there were no unifying doctrines. Other than the fact that everything was oral tradition. There was not agreement on what the scripture was or what defined it, or Because there was no collective voice. It was like, it was more like, small little pockets. The baptismal rituals were all over the place. No one talked about things systematically. So the way we understand the church it was just, I would say it was loosey-goosey. And I think that we see, in some ways, a similar expression of that in the non-denominational church. Except for the fact the non-denominational church is reacting to 1900 years of church history, and the early church was reacting to the event of Jesus and the apostolic period of writing and spirit moving in the early church. Constantine has a conversion moment in 313. Constantine decriminalizes Christianity, so it's no longer a crime in 318. You can turn that off if you want. Is that what you're going to?
No,
Oh, okay. Okay, we won't listen. Yeah, that's right. I didn't know if it was, I was a little concerned. And then in 325, you have the Council of Nicaea. And this is where we get the Nicene Creed. The first time we have any sort of unifying of the church. No denominations, this was the church. This was not the East Church, this was not the West Church, this was the church. You have Nicaea, and then I think it's 381 or 391, Theodosius makes Christianity the official, legal, sanctioned religion of the Western Empire. Things going on in Greece on the eastern side with the Greek church and what would eventually become the Western church, but in the West there was this definitive nature, and the Eastern church was involved in those councils. Keep in mind, this is not like it was the West was established, but that was the first council, and then there was a series of councils that don't really matter right now. We're not going through them, but that defined what we believed in who God and Christ was. This is where we get God fully divine, fully human, where we get our Trinitarian theology, where we get Mary as the mother of God, and all of this factors in. And that Theotokos, Mary, mother of God thing is pretty important because we wouldn't get the full divinity and full humanity of Christ without it. But no one is disagreeing. It's all these little pockets of people coming together, and they're finally finding some cohesion together, and we're agreeing. These are the essentials. So when we talk about the essentials, we go back to those things. Now, the essentials are who Christ was, but the things that we confess in unison with the rest of the global church, or the global visible church, come from the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, which overlap in 95% in content and in language, probably, and maybe 80% language. And those are the things that define us. So when we talk about the things that all of us believe, that if you met someone who was Orthodox, no matter what Orthodox position, unless they were a crazy liberal Orthodox or a crazy liberal Roman Catholic or a crazy liberal Protestant, Jesus still is at the center. So, but there are some within the fellowships of all of those traditions that do, question Jesus's role or divinity or composition. Then there were some invasions, and Rome fell, and culture fell, and the church fell. And the church went underground. This is where you have Benedict going off into the hills. This is where you have monasticism rise. So for the next 200 years, the church is defined by monasticism more than it is by institutional expression. Still, no divisions. We're all one church. You still have an Eastern-Western church that largely is divided by language. So, the Romance languages, or Latin, or Greek, and then eventually Russian. But those two languages divided, but there was unification in most of the belief systems. And so for the first few hundred years of the church, it's all good. We're all the same. We're all believing the same. We're coming together. But we're also defining doctrines, and we're making standards that don't really allow any more room. And if anyone has anything outside of that, they don't form a new denomination. They're considered a heretic and are either burnt or killed. Because that was the level of redemption that existed at the time. I do believe we continue to evolve in terms of our understanding of humanity and how we approach and are empathetic and embrace one another despite differences, whereas differences would seem like a threat 1,000, 1,500 years ago. Now we can see differences in openness and in compassion, and I think, again, in a degradation of the material world and in favor of the spiritual world. But we have and I've said this before, there was a major shift. Gregory the Great comes on the scene and institutes Benedictine spirituality for all of the Western Empire. And that is the defining characteristic of all of humanity. So when people talk about Benedictines, it's not Roman Catholic. Benedictines are Benedictines. They existed long before there was any division between East and West in terms of theology or expression. So Gregor the Great defines, though, the West, and a little bit more, and this is where you do get at the beginning of a Western emphasis, through the theology, through the expression, through the practices of Benedict. And you see the proliferation of monastic communities from about 600 to about 1,000, or really, and honestly, it ebbs and flows. You have, in the 1200s, you have Bernard of Clairvaux, and Catherine of Siena, and you have a new version of Cistercian monasticism that's different from Benedictine monasticism, and then you have the Trappist in the 17th century, and you have some small movements in between. But what's interesting, and I've said this before, but it's interesting about every monastic renewal movement is it always returns to work. Because in each one of these places, as they got oblates or confrates or novates that were people who came in and did the work of the community so that the monks could pray, there began to be corruption, ironically. And so a deep monastic theology is that work and prayer are handmaidens. And in the dwelling that Adam and Eve were given in the garden, it wasn't just hang out with God all day in the cool of the evening throughout the day, just chilling with God. It was tend the garden, work and prayer. Prayer being to walk with God. Well, a major shift happened, and this is where we get the beginning of the differentiation between the two major traditions of the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. And that falls in the category of 1054, the Great Schism. We don't need to go into it, but that's where we have the beginning of the Roman Catholic Church, or the Roman Church. But it would be called the Roman, or the Latin, or the Western Church, versus the Greek, or the Orthodox, or what's the comparable? Roman, Greek, or I guess it's Greek language too. Latin and Eastern Church, East Greek Orthodox.
Wasn't that because it was also political power?
Political power, and that was defined, the split was way more political than it was theological. It was couched under the idea of where the Spirit comes from. Does it come from, again, God and the God, just the God the Father, or God and the Son? We in the West believe it's from God and the Son, because we believe in that, a fuller view of that Trinity, I would say. The Orthodox Church has the Spirit of God in that time coming from only the God the Father. But then you have a massive split, and so you have the Orthodox running in this constant. Now you have the Roman Catholic in 1054, so you have two East and West running along. And then the Great Reformation happens, and so you have the Gregory the Great, the Great Schism, and the Great Reformation. And this is where the Catholic Church gets their definitive nature as the Roman Catholic Church, with the infallible Pope and all the power that exists in there, because it was a power struggle. And for the next 500 years is a power struggle. How does the church in England, your way, England, deal with the church in Rome? Well, it flip-flopped back and forth. That's why I like to make, jokes about Episcopalians and Anglicans, more than Anglicans, that they can't figure out which side of the fence to sit on, so they just sit on the middle. That's why they're so rigid, because they're sitting on those posts. Yeah, that's a bad joke. But it's funny. You have Protestant theology, you have the Great Reformation, where you have three great traditions: Lutheranism, Reformed theology, which comes out of Calvin, which leads to Baptist and Reformed and Presbyterian thought, and Methodism. And then you also have Zwingli, who comes out of the Swiss Reformed Church. And so you have these three, and we'll talk about them when it comes time to talk about Reformation, but three massive movements. And then that carries on until you get the first, second, third Great Awakening that come, where you have Methodism and Wesleyanism emerging out of that. And you have these denominations that are based in some sense of holiness or theories of perfection, because you're moving away from that doctrine of total depravity to free will expressions. And so everything from the beginning of Methodism and Wesleyanism, everything that Wesley brought to the table, turns people towards, you have a choice, you have a distinct. But it also comes at the time of the Enlightenment, where we're no longer solely formed as societies, we're formed as individuals, because I think, therefore I am, therefore I'm an individual. So my biggest beef with where the churches happens in the last few centuries is because we've moved to a place where individualism, that I'm an individual being and, you know, an entity and unto myself, has defined our breaks and our schisms in the last few centuries more than anything else. And they're over stupid things and they're over important things. But the fact of the matter is we see this differentiation of the church, and that tribalization that exists in who we are as humans still keeps us separated. And then you have sort of in the early 1800s, you have the beginning of the evangelical movement that leads into the 1900s with the holiness movements, and that whole period was a period of restorationists, a return to what was prior to the institutional Christianity, and although they hadn't developed as institutions themselves. So for a lot of you and then you have around the turn of the century, a little bit after that, you have Azusa Street, and you have Pentecostalism, you have holiness movements. In that same period of this restorationist part of the church, you also have cults emerge, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons. You have Christian Science come in. And so as we grow, and you see culture affect us, well, we become more and more divisive about what we believe, and then it becomes church shopping and hopping for your own needs. And what happens then is during the Boomer era, we went from this pastoral model of ministry, where we operated within traditions. You go back to the 1920s and 30s, there wasn't much non-denominationalism, although there was this movement of holiness or Pentecostalism. That sense of being connected to a church and a pastor turned into a more programmatic, guided, dealing with, and really centered around youth and developmental stuff. And that really comes out of the Boomer era that said, you know what, I don't like the church, I'm going to form a new one. And now we're finally in an era where we have an entire generation, millennials, who have pretty much left the church. And we're seeing what I think is kind of that full circle. We're going back to that back to that early church period, where we see a myriad of views of faith. All right, any questions on that? That's the history.
Why does the geographical, east and west and north and south, all cause such a big division?
We just view things differently. I mean, there was a study done on the different regions of the US, and it was New England, Midwest, Southeast, South, and I think Texas was a little bit of an anomaly because it carried some overlap with the South, but not pure. It's not like Mississippi South. Southwest and Pacific Northwest, and each one of these, and then the Great Plains, and each one of these regions valued different things. So for example, when I come from a region in the Midwest that values honesty and information, and communicating that communicates respect. Have you ever heard of Northwest Nice? From the Pacific Northwest Nice, it's a little bit of a passive aggressive niceness. We're like, hey, I love to see, let's get together. No one ever means that. That would be totally inauthentic. It would not go down in the Midwest traditionally. I think this day and age, in the decade we're in now, those lines are blurred because of everyone's transplanting. But you still, it's no secret that in the South there is a passive aggressiveness there. Oh, bless your heart. And then you don't mean that. You're like, that little, so there, and you go up and I did most of my theological education in Jersey. Very frank. Bluntness is how you show your respect. It doesn't make a difference if you're being rude. There's no niceness involved in that. Honesty and bluntness. You just say what you think and you communicate with honking your horns. All of those different regional characteristics, I would say historically, again, I think it's broken down a little bit, are going to affect the expression of faith, because faith is always an expression of the body of people and the community of people. And so
Don't you think that's shifting though?
I think it's blurring.
It's blurring because everybody's
moving.
more.
And internet and globalization and yeah, I mean 100% it's blurring, but you can still see the dregs of the traditions that we grew up in. And your generations and my generation are probably the last. Your generation, it's sort of a much more blended. You're a patchwork generation in a way that we weren't. We grew up with some sense of identity. And I can say I was Methodist, Assemblies of God, Presbyterian. You're like, I'm not really sure. It doesn't really, but it doesn't matter. I mean, and that's not to say that one's better or the other by any means. It just means that's how culture is formed. You're always influenced by the environment you grow up in. And if you grow up in your patchworking, working yourself together, you're a bricolage identity of all sorts of different expressions. And how many people know in the denominations, I mean, after this course, you'll know what each of these believe and why they believe, but in the end, it's not ultimately, doesn't really matter. So maybe, there's some truth in that.
Ethnic influences there too, aren't there?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the collective nature of those cultures and how those traditions are passed down, which is why when you look at the National Study of Youth and Religion, Roman Catholics and mainline Protestants do the worst job of passing down faith, and Mormons and Pentecostals and then ethnic churches do the best. So, collective cultures. I think there are really 4 things that unite all of us. One, I think that our earliest creeds, they define us as a people. The Bible, and we'll talk about that, although that it exists, not in your interpretation, understanding of how it exists, but that we all view it as inspired, we all view it as some sense of authority in our lives. Now, the nature of that, how we believe that could be different, but it's still there nonetheless. I think culture unites us in our world here. We're all part of the Western world. That gives us a similar, a common expression, a common language, a common understanding, even in that diversity. But I think ultimately, not surprisingly, it's the Spirit. And I think that's what transcends culture, transcends centuries, transcends theologies. The Spirit of God is moving in with us. Okay, I guess we did fill the time. All right, this is what everything we're going to look at through these categories. And again, I may add a couple more, but right now I have 10. And I'm going to just throw them at you just so you know. So this, we're going to go through. This is the cause, and we're going to go through them in this order because they're in this order for a reason. We're going to go through them systematically. So the first question is, what is the cosmology? And that's not a doctrine. What do I mean by that? How do you understand and view the world? When you look up, do you right now feel like there are celestial beings rolling around us? Do you feel like the world is devoid of spirits? Do you feel like there's some, and oftentimes we don't even want to acknowledge that, do we think actually that the dead in Christ are floating around and hovering? Do we see it as ghosts? Do we see it as some sort of otherworldly celestial being? I think I've toyed and dabbled with that myself. But that sense of, there are 3 things or 3 categories that we'll talk about, and this is where we'll talk about God. Most of us will confess similar things about God, but the way we understand God's work in the world differs. The way Presbyterians and Methodists understand God working in the world is different. The way Roman Catholics and Pentecostals understand God's work in the world is different. And not that it's not a Venn diagram where there's a lot of overlap, but there's nuances that differentiate us. So where is God? How do we view God? How do we view the spirit celestial world? Roman Catholics have, for example, 9 levels of celestial beings. We looked at that a couple summers ago. We in the Protestant Presbyterian world don't even really talk about celestial beings. Do you believe the sun and the moon were actually celestial beings that guide the day and the night? Do you believe there are beings and authorities and powers that govern the natural laws that we live in? Some people don't, some people do. And that understanding is grounding for a denomination. You may not even realize those things are grounding, but it's where the basis of all things starts. So who is God? What was there before the material world? So God, in the sense of the encompassing nature of God, the spirit world and the spirit world that God created, and the created world, how you understand this world. And not necessarily in terms of creation or evolution, but how you understand the function of this world. Can spirits embody tables? Are we panentheistic? Do we believe that God's spirit is in everything? Do you believe that God is deistic and that God's off in the cosmos and looks down on us? Those are all massive things that differentiate different understandings of the traditions. Creation. Do you believe in a 6,000 or 8,000 year view of the world, or do you believe in a billion-year world of some sort of evolution? As I've told you before, I'm a theistic evolutionist. I believe in evolution. I don't claim it. I claim God evolved the world in this process. It's give 100% credit to God for how the world evolved, but I can't look at petrified rocks in the national park and say this is 6,000 years old. I think God given us brains, and to say there is carbon dating. Does that mean someone who believes in a 6,000 year world And that God snapped these things into existence is wrong? Not at all. Again, this is the loosey-goosey stuff. I don't know, maybe God did. I don't have any proof of that. Maybe God put those million, in the carbon dating and all the things that go, I don't know, and I'm okay with that. It doesn't affect my view of you. It doesn't affect our view of understanding of who Christ was. Anthropology, who are we? What are we as humans? Do we have free will? What is the nature of our depravity? Or how fallen are we? Is there some capacity in us that was still enabled? How does the image of God exist in us? And what role and function does that play? What is the pre-fallen and post-fallen nature of humanity? These things differ between different denominations. Not hugely, but they do. One of the biggest things we're going to look at is Scripture. We would probably all hold that it is inspired and authoritative, but we don't all agree on the books. The Orthodox Church doesn't have this, and all the Orthodox churches and expressions and Catholic expressions don't always agree on it. How does the role of the Apocrypha play into it? What are the books we choose? Do we see some as more authoritative or less authoritative? Different traditions hold that differently. Do we hold infallibility? Most traditions do. We don't all hold inerrancy, and I've said that time again. I don't at all. I think the Bible is filled with errors. The version we have, because there are 2,000 versions of it, and none of them are perfect. So there are errors there. The fact that King James translated 3 concepts of hell into a singular word and giving us one unified understanding that the cultures that the language that was written in, that God spoke it to, if we believe in that inspiration, that means that King James made a mistake. And every time we say hell, we aren't referring to something in particular. We are loosely talking about a concept that is, throughout the biblical witness, has a multitude of expressions or a multiplicity of understandings that is framed by the very origin of the culture that it came from. And so, do you take it literal? Is it cultural? And to what extent is it cultural? Some will say, oh, the prohibition for homosexuality was a cultural narrative. And so was women wearing, head coverings. And I often say to people who say no, that homosexuality was a mandate against, everything we have to take and we have to take literally. Well, then I say, and often I remember one conversation where some woman was telling me this, and I'm like, well, if you take the Bible so literally, you shouldn't even be having this conversation with me, because I'm a man and I am the authority. So go get your head covering on, go talk to your husband and have him come talk to me. That's what Scripture tells us to do to some extent. But that's a contextual thing. But the question is once you start making one thing context, where do you draw the line of? This is the whole abortion debate, and I'm not going to get into this today, but does life begin at conception, or prior to that, but does life begin at conception, or do you believe that it's a blob of tissue until birth? Well, Ben Shapiro, who is an advocate, and many of you may have heard his voice, he's pro-life as he believes. And he said anything in between, any deviation, any decision of where life begins in this period from conception to birth is arbitrary. What do we know? So if you hold that it's here, then it's taking life. If you hold that it's a blob of tissue, then abortion is not a problem. Because if the spirit enters the body at life, at breath, as in God breathed into Adam, then it makes more sense why, and Ben Shapiro, who is a very conservative person on this, says, I can't argue with the person who sees it as a blob of tissue, because they're starting with a different cosmology of how they view the world. And that's why we start with cosmology. We are, I think, in this world going to look at Israel in relationship to dispensationalism, and that's the idea that God has come through segments. There was a dispensation for everyone. Pre-fallen was a dispensation. Fallen was God was eventually trying to reach all of humanity, and then a different dispensation when God reached out to Israel. A different dispensation when Christ came on the scene. A different dispensation when the Spirit came on the scene, and then there will be a different dispensation when Christ reigns for 1,000 years. We'll talk about that and how that differs. And how Israel fits into that. Jesus, was he a moral exemplar? Was he just here to show us the way? Was he actual penal substitution in the sense that God was going to punish us and Jesus saved us from that, which is the predominant view? Was it the satisfaction theory that God needed death? Well, that's a dark view of God, but there's argument for that. Or was Jesus a Christus Victor? Did they trick Satan into thinking that he was actually getting the power, and then all of a sudden they did this like, ha, we tricked you, which I love that narrative just for the drama. The church, who is it? What is our mission? This is the notion of ecclesiology. And some churches will say it's justice and poor. We see that in Scripture. That's the emphasis of it. Some it's proclamation. Some it's evangelism. Some it's persuasion. Some it's personal transformation. Some it's societal transformation. We all put different emphases on these. You go to the evangelical church, there's not a lot of justice work being done. There's a lot of proclamation work. You go to the mainline church, oftentimes there's not a lot of proclamation work done, and they're trying to show love through, or what they believe their faith is through, justice work and charity work. Is any of it wrong? No, it's all right. It's all wrong. It's, it's like Christ was both reprobate and elect in that. Almost done, sorry. Soteriology, which is what does it mean to be saved? What is the relationship with God? Is it communal? Is it individual? What is the role of the church? What should our relationship with the church? Does salvation come through the body of the church? Well, we would say no, but some throughout history thought it did. What role does faith play? The big mantra of the Reformation was faith alone. The church is outside of that. What role does works play? James speaks to our idea that we're supposed to be, faith without works is dead. So how do those things factor in, and where do we place emphasis? Sacraments. How many are there? Baptism, infant baptism, believer baptism. Should we sprinkle? Should we immerse? Is it done in community? Can you do it down by the river? All of these are differentiations. We're going to look at all of those. What does it do? What happens there? Eucharist. Holy cow, that will need a whole, that'll be a big thing for all of us, because it changes. How is it done? What is the practices around that? Who is it for? Who should be doing it? Who should be administrating? Why are we doing it? And what is actually happening in it? That differs for every denomination. And lastly, in the major categories was worship and liturgy. How ought we worship? And we're going to find that that is more historically bound to the different time period that it comes through and how people express that. And there's a freedom now to invent and have emergent types of worship and alternative worship. And it's not a bad thing, but that's all historically and contextually bound. And the last thing I added at the beginning of the class, and there may be something else, is generally what is the polity of the church? I value the polity of the Presbyterian Church over and against pretty much all the other denominations. I think we're rocking it. So I'll advocate for that in my time. But what is, the Pope rules everything, but there's a system that functions there. The Orthodox Church, similar function. You go down to the local church, take Grace, for example. Who is the authority there? What is their form of government? How do they guide that church? Baptist or congregational? They have some set of guidelines they can kind of follow, but they pretty much can do what they want. Presbyterians have to follow a book of order. We have regulations and rules and stipulations. We're the most organized, structured outside of probably the Roman Catholic Church, which has the historical jump on us. But all of those things factor into, and if we can understand just generally how each of these denominations, traditions believe, it gives us a sense of charity, a sense of grace, a sense of appreciation, and I think really a fuller view of who God is. I think my view of God is what it is because I have an understanding of all of these things. And I think it's important that we do too. So we're going to end there, invite some friends. Let's create a learning community. Okay? All right, and final questions, anything? It's a lot, I know.
Yeah.
But we're going to compartmentalize it. So, and I don't know if you all like taking notes, but I can put these categories on a blank sheet that every week you can pick up and you can write the tradition at the top and then maybe jot down. I'm not going to do worksheets or anything, but if that's helpful for you just to be at the end, be able to sort of look at some of those, just generally we can do that. And then I'll have these categories on the left and you can just jot down something, and you don't have to use it if you don't want to, but I know that because we're going through very similar doctrinal categories for each of them, it could be helpful for comparison. So.
What church are you doing?
We're starting historically. We're going through historic, Orthodox. We'll start with the Orthodox Church, then that'll take us through the first millennia, and then millennium, and then we'll pick up the Roman Catholic Church, and then we'll pick up the three Lutheran, Presbyterian, and the spin-offs of Zwingli, and we'll carry on from there. Okay? Sound good? All right. No final questions?